Thomas Nicholson. Thomas Nicholson of the King's Dragoon Guards was the son of George Nicholson, a butcher in Neyburn, a village outside of York in the county of Yorkshire. He was born in 1791, enlisted in York, fought at Waterloo with the King's Dragoon Guards, rose to become a troop sergeant major, and retired to become landlord of the Light Horseman public house close to the cavalry barracks in York. Today, his remains lie in the Victorian cemetery opposite the Light Horseman and close to the cavalry barracks. He enlisted in 1809, giving his trade as a labourer, and served underage for a year. He then served another 8.5 years as a trooper before being promoted to corporal in 1818. In July 1823, he was promoted to sergeant. He evidently considered retiring from the service, as he had completed the 11 years for which he had signed up, but elected to remain in the army. In September 1831, he became a troop sergeant major. What do we know of the man himself? He was aged 17 on enlistment. He was 5'6" in height and grew to be 5'10". He then signed with his mark, but clearly, as he was significantly promoted, he had become literate. He possibly attested on the day after his 17th birthday in York. When he retired in 1842, he was discharged on account of pain in his lower limbs and loins. He was then 52 years and 4 months old. He had brown hair, grey eyes, a flushed complexion, and was by now 5'9.5" in height. His character was described thus. He has conducted himself during the whole service as a most excellent soldier and non-commissioned officer. He received around 7 sabre wounds at the back at Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815. And what of the King's Dragoon Guards at Waterloo? The following is a letter from Private Stanley of No. 1 Troop of the King's Dragoon Guards, and it gives a fine picture of life on campaign. Brussels, Flemish Flanders, 15th of May, 1815. Dear Cousin, I take this opportunity of writing to you, hoping this will find you all in good health, as it leaves me at present. I thank God for it. I have had a very rough march since I last saw you at Button. We are only 15 miles away from Mr. Bonaparte's army. I wish we could have a rap at him every day. We have the most cavalry of the English that ever was at one time gathered, and in good spirits. We have lost a few horses by our marching. I have the pleasure to say my horse is better every day, which I think him to be my best friend. There is no doubt of us beating the confounded rascal. It may cost me my life, and that will be as for many more as well, but that will be the fortune of war. My life I set no store by. This is the finest country except so far before England. The people is so civil. We have one good thing cheap, and that is tobacco, and everything accordingly. Tobacco is 4 pennies per pound, and gin is 1 shilling and 8 pence, and everything in proportion. Our allowance per day is 1 pound of beef, and 1.5 pounds of bread, and half a pint of gin. But the worst of it all is we don't get it regular, and we don't get it the day it's due. We lose it, which is often the case, I assure you. I hope you will never think of being a soldier. I assure you it is a very rough concern. I have wrote to my sister Anne, and I'm afraid she thinks the trouble too much to answer. I have not had the pleasure of lying in a bed since in the country. Thank God the weather is fine, which is in our favour. We get no pay at all, only our bed and meat and gin. We have had 10 pennies per day stopped from us, which we shall receive when 6 months has expired. I thank God I have a friend with me. I hope you will excuse my bad writing and spelling. My love to aunts and cousins, Mrs. Darby, cousin Joseph, and family at Edwiston, and all that think so well of me to ask after me. Charles Stanley, No. 1 Troop, King's Dragoon Guards. In a letter written to his wife, Regimental Sergeant Major Barlow wrote, "On the 16th of June at 3 o'clock in the morning, our late and lamented Shelver," he was to be killed at Waterloo, "called me up and informed me that an order had been received to march immediately. About 5 o'clock, the regiment moved for Nivelles, distance of about 45 miles. Captain Naylor of 6th Troop arrived at Nineve, the cavalry headquarters. We arrived about 8 o'clock and remained an hour when, with the brigade under Lord Edward Somerset, consisting of the 1st and 2nd Life Guards, Blues, and 1st Dragoon Guards, marched for Engines, which place we left on our right and went to Braine-le-Comte, where we halted an hour to wait, and marched at 5 o'clock for Nivelles. Before our arrival at Nivelles we heard a cannonade, and at times could distinctly see a smoke at some distance. When we came to Nivelles, many wounded were arriving, and we were informed that an action was commenced at 4 o'clock. General Picton's division consisted of the 1st, 28th, 32nd, 42nd, 79th, 92nd, 95th, etc., had suffered much, as well as the Belgians. They had been repeatedly charged by the French cuirassiers. The 16th of June was a very stifling day. The route towards Quatre Bras was crowded. The King's Dragoon Guards arrived at Braine-le-Comte around 4 p.m. to feed, and were ordered to water their horses. They then pushed on. R.S.M. Barlow described the approach towards Nivelles. When within about 5 miles of that place, we distinctly heard the enemy's cannonading. The light cavalry, who were in our front, threw away their forage and advanced to face the enemy, but did not get up in time enough to prevent the enemy cavalry from pressing our infantry very hard. But our brave fellows kept their ground till the cavalry arrived, when the cowardly French ran away. On our approach to the field of battle, we met a great many wounded officers and men coming in. Naylor later describes coming onto the battlefield. It was almost dark, about 8 o'clock, when we arrived in the field and formed close column on the side of the road. By this time the firing had nearly ceased, and after remaining about an hour, we marched to our bivouac in front of Genappe. The horses remained saddled, the enemy being in a large wood 2 miles to our front. Watering then took place, with the soldiers going hungry, as the commissariat had been delayed along the choked roads. Rising well before dawn, the King's Dragoon Guards were at stand to. Captain Mercer, the horse artillery officer and diarist, was close by, and he described the scene at daylight. The corn was trampled down, particularly in the plain, plentifully besprinkled with the bodies of the slain. Just in front of the farm of Quatre Bras, there was a fearful scene of slaughter, Highlanders and cuirassiers lying thickly strewn about. During the retreat to Waterloo, the King's Dragoon Guards had little contact with the French cavalry. Naylor explained in his letter that, "We continued to retire and form on either side of the road. As we passed through Genappe, we experienced the most severe fall of rain I ever beheld. A short distance from Genappe, the 1st Life Guards charged a body of lancers who were pressing our rear. They charged in columnar divisions on the road, and we formed for the same purpose, but the enemy retiring, we did not charge." Troop Sergeant Major James Page described the thunderstorms as one of the heaviest storms of rain ever known, accompanied by thunder and lightning. The fall of rain was so heavy that in the fields that were covered in corn, our horses sunk in every step, up to near the hock. It is out of my power to herein express our situation. Our boots were filled with water, and as our arms hung down by our sides, the water ran off as a stream at the ends of our fingers. The only King's Dragoon Guards to fight during the retirement were Captain Sweeney's troop, who skirmished with the enemy and had to be assisted during their withdrawal from contact by Captain Barlow's troop. It was during this incident that Troop Sergeant Major Page took a French cavalry horse, complete with arms and saddle, only for the farrier to whom he had passed it to lose it later in the day. The strength of the regiment. The regiment was the strongest of the 10 Allied heavy cavalry regiments present at Waterloo. When the farriers and quartermasters' men are subtracted from the 613 all ranks listed as being on campaign, there were around 540 sabres present on the bridge that morning. Captain Elton wrote of the first charge. Our infantry suddenly broke out of their line into solid squares, and we saw the crest of the cuirassiers. The line, without waiting for any particular orders, drew swords and set off at full speed. Every squadron took the interval of our infantry, which was next to them. Troop Sergeant Major Page recollected that the French infantry and cavalry came boldly into the bottom of a very large field, while we were formed at the other end. They charged our infantry, and as soon as they showed themselves to our front, the word charge was given for our brigade by Colonel Fuller. It's not certain whether Elton's squadron charged down the slope to their front or veered to their left behind La Haye-Sainte, but as he makes reference to the ravine and then seeing Lord Uxbridge, this suggests that he was to the east. This also implies that Naylor's squadron, as the left centre squadron, was also to the east of the farm, as was the left squadron under Captain Turner. Private Derry was in Turner's troop and describes the action. Our household brigade of heavy dragoons charged the French brigades of cuirassiers, men clothed in steel armour. While passing through the lines of infantry, they opening out in company, they shouted, "Now we've lathered them, do you go on and shave them?" Lathered with bullets, thus we met sword in hand, and such a crash of armour, knocked off helmets, etc. They fled, and we followed on. As John Morwood has written, the heavy cavalry probably arrived at a trot rather than a charge, and it was Somerset who famously wrote later, "You might have fancied it was so many tinkers at work." As the rest of the household brigade fought with the cuirassiers, Major Graham's squadron on the right of the King's Dragoon Guards seemed to have ridden on, isolating itself from support. Graham's squadron consisted of the 2nd and 5th Troops, and perhaps this is where Nicholson received his significant wound. Derry writes, "The colonel and the adjutant, captains and majors, with lieutenants and cornets, were killed with men and horses. Major Graham took command, gave the word loudly, 'King's Dragoon Guards, three's about.' None returned, and he swore, 'You may go to hell and be damned.' We went cutting and slashing on all the way till the horses were spent, and we began to return, in which the major, neither watchful nor prayerful, was pierced by a French lancer, and fell down dead." Perhaps 2/3 of the squadron cut their way out of the enveloping French cavalry and returned to the ridge. Hibbert was to sum up the overall performance of the heavies in a letter. "Our brigade, never having been on service before, hardly knew how to act. They knew they were to charge, but never thought about stopping at a proper time, so that after entirely cutting to pieces a large body of cuirassiers, double their number, they still continued to gallop on, instead of forming up and getting into line. The consequence was that they got among the French infantry and artillery, and then were miserably cut up." Private Hasker, of 3 Troop, was to the east of La Haye-Sainte, returning to the ridge when his horse stumbled and fell. Attacked by a French dragoon, his helmet was knocked off and his head cut open. He also lost part of a little finger in attempting to ward off a blow with his hand. Throwing himself to the ground, he was then stabbed in the back by a passing lancer before being bayoneted and plundered by French infantry, losing his watch, money, canteen, haversack and trousers, and all the time Allied artillery rounds landed around him. Goldsborough points out that there was a large proportion of fatalities amongst both the 2nd Life Guards and the King's Dragoon Guards, who charged alongside them than the greater part of the brigade. He suggests that many may well have been killed by parties of the same French lancers who killed Ponsonby of the Union Brigade. There is also a suggestion that some of the dismounted Household Brigade who were unhorsed in the muddy valley were also subsequently killed by the lancers. Other King's Dragoon Guard casualties came from infantry in the La Haye Sainte orchard and from the steep bank of the cutting near the sandpit. The cavalry, as they attempted to regain the Allied ridge, were also assisted by the brigades of Vandeleur and Guigny's Dutch-Belgian brigade. And what of the rest of the day? Goldsborough says that there is far less reporting amongst the King's Dragoon Guard diarists and letter writers about this time. And in part this was because so many of those writers were either wounded or dismounted. For the heavies and other Allied cavalry, a series of countercharges then followed, as Ney led the French cavalry in the ill-judged assaults on the supposedly retiring Allies. Vivian, writing to Siborne on moving on his initiative to the centre of the battlefield, described the sight of the two heavy brigades. Lord Edward Somerset, with the wretched remains of the two heavy brigades, not 200 men and horses, retired through me, and I then remained for about half an hour, exposed to the most dreadful fire of shot, shell, and musketry that it is possible to imagine. No words can give any idea of it. How any man escaped me is a miracle. We every instant expecting through the smoke to see the enemy appearing under our noses, for the smoke was literally so thick that we could not see 10 yards off. Major Dorville describes the actions of the heavy cavalry on the repulse of the Imperial Guard infantry attack, and of the light infantry and foot guards. The heavy cavalry and the Royal Dragoons, amongst the rest, were for the most part reduced to a small number, so much so that the several regiments were formed into an indiscriminate squadron, in front of them being some of the most distinguished officers of the different brigades. The heavy cavalry being, at that period of the day, so much reduced, the light cavalry of Vandeleur and Vivian were brought forward and formed up with the heavy. On the general advance being signalled, the wretched brigades moved forward, and in Clark Kennedy's words, clashed in a half-hearted words, as we were so tired that the shock was not so great. And the last casualties were inflicted on the King's Dragoon Guards, Captain Battersby and his servant Private Thomas Woodman, both being killed in this affair. The King's Dragoon Guards halted for the night around the area of the present-day Wounded Eagle Memorial. And R.S.M. Barlow wrote that they were barely 32 files strong at that moment. Corporal Stubbings described the scene next morning. It is dreadful to relate the scenes I saw on the 18th. The field for miles around was covered with the wounded and slain, and in some places my horse could not pass out without trampling on them, and I am sorry to inform you that Charles Stanley fell on the ever memorable day, the 18th, fighting manfully in the defence of his country. Thomas Nicholson survived and went on to become a Troop Sergeant Major. And we do have one example of him speaking from the past. And that is 1843, when sadly, outside of his public house, the Light Horseman, a local farmer fell off his horse whilst returning from market. And Thomas Nicholson was at the inquest. I knew the deceased. His name was Thomas Isles. He resided at Neyburn and was a farmer there. I have heard from his family that he was 51 years of age. He was brought into my house on Saturday night in a state of insensibility and died about 11 o'clock the same night. Mr. Hope, the surgeon, was fetched by me, and he attended him. Thomas Nicholson was to have 8 years as landlord of the Light Horseman, before dying in December 1850 and being buried alongside his wife in the Old Victorian Cemetery.